Well, welcome back, everybody. So we're looking at the second half of Sellars' essay today. There were just a couple things that I didn't get to mention last time that I wanted to. And the first is, remember in the class 2 times ago, I talked about Sellars' anti-descriptivism. His view that you shouldn't just assume that the job of declarative sentences is to state facts, or in a sense that involves describing how the world is, that there are other things you can do with language, that those are not second-class functions, they're just different functions. And I wanted to emphasize that his account of looks talk is an instance of that, where Descartes took it for granted that when you say how things look, you're describing something, appearances, lookings, and then realized that these things have to be rather strange. You can't be mistaken about these appearances. That distinguishes them from everything else in the world. And Sellars' account is anti-descriptivist. He says, look at what you're doing when you make a looks claim first. And what you'll see is you're expressing a disposition to make a report, but you're withholding an endorsement of it. Withholding an endorsement is a kind of doing that's different from describing or representing how things are. A way of putting this, remember in the anti-descriptivist discussion, I talked about Hugh Price's distinction between object naturalism and subject naturalism. Object naturalism, where you try and find a specification of whatever you're talking about, the properties you're describing things as having, the way you're representing the world as being. You try to specify all of that in a naturalistic vocabulary, in the vocabulary of some natural science. Whereas subject naturalism, you try and specify the discursive practices that people are engaging in, the performances they're producing, sort of the process of learning to talk that way, and in a naturalistic vocabulary. And if you can do that, his suggestion is, then that's as naturalistic as you need to be about some form of discourse. I mentioned Wittgenstein's wanting to treat numbers that way. So don't worry about what numbers are. If you can give a common or garden variety naturalistic account of young children learning to use numerals, to count, to add, and so on, then you can be perfectly naturalistic about number talk. And it's only a particular overextended semantic model that's making you wonder about where the numbers are that they're talking about. They aren't in that sense talking about anything the thought is. And I suggested that you could divide through by the naturalism in the subject naturalism, object naturalism debate, or divide distinction, and that then what you got was the difference between specifying what's going on when you're talking in a representational semantic metavocabulary that talks about meanings and representation, as opposed to describing it in a pragmatic metavocabulary, vocabulary if we're talking about what you're doing rather than what you're saying in the descriptivist sense. So the main connection I wanted to make was between the overarching anti-descriptivism in Sellars' methodology and the account of looks talk as a particular instance of that. We'll see he's also anti-descriptivist about abstract object talk, starting next week, and indeed about alethic modal talk 3 weeks from now. Second thing is, I talked about 2 confirmations, as it seems to me, not necessarily knockdown, drag-out confirmations, definitive, dispositive, settling considerations, but good reason to think that Sellars' account of Look's talk is cutting at important joints, is getting at something important, namely his capacity to make sense of merely generic lookings, the chiliagon, the thousand-sided figure, looking merely many-sided, but not looking exactly 1,000-sided or exactly 999 or whatever, and his capacity to explain scoped lookings, the difference between there looks to be a red apple over there, the apple over there looks to be red, and there's a red apple over there, just by how much of the endorsement you're withholding and what you're making. There's a third confirmation that he doesn't mention, never talks about this. I don't know whether he just never thought of it or what. And that is not on the side of cognition, but on the side of action, agency. Because it's not just that Descartes thought on the side of cognition that there were these mental events, appearings to us, where the thing you're aware of and the awareness of it aren't two separate things. They're one thing. So there's no choice, no chance of misrepresentation. He also thought something comparable on the side of doings, because he thought there were acts of will, volitions, which were a kind of doing. Willing, he thought of as a kind of doing, but a very special kind of doing, because where with ordinary doings, you could try to do that thing, try to put the ball through the hoop. But with willing to put the ball through the hoop, that you couldn't try to do and fail. That you could just do. The willing might not bring about the ball going through the hoop, so you might fail in putting the ball through the hoop, but you couldn't fail to will that the ball go through the hoop. If that's what you wanted to do, you could will it. And just as he had a real-life phenomenon to explain on the cognitive side, why there's a distinction between something being round and it's merely looking round. Maybe it isn't round, it just looks round, but there isn't, that distinction doesn't iterate. You can't make the same kind of distinction. Well, are you sure that it really looks round? Maybe it only seems to you to look round. Looks to look round. You say, no, that doesn't make any sense. On the side of agency, the same thing is true of tries. You say, maybe you didn't actually put the ball through the hoop, and you say, yes, but I tried to do it. You say, well, are you sure you tried? Maybe you merely tried to try. We say, no, trying to try is trying. I know that I tried to do it. I just may have failed. And so Descartes says, so there are these minimal kinds of doings. Think of the minimal kinds of knowings or of seeings. There are these minimal kinds of doings, which are volitions, tryings to do things. And they have this remarkable feature that you can't try and fail to try. Can't try and fail to will, at least. That distinction only applies to the gap between willing and actually doing. But for these special minimal doings, there is no such gap. Well, if we now make the move on the side of agency that Sellars made on the side of cognition, we say, well, what are you doing when you say, well, I don't know whether the ball went through the hoop or not, but at least that's what I was trying to do. What are you doing? Well, you're expressing your goal, what the reason was for what you did, what the criteria of success were. That was the ball going through the hoop. You're expressing that, but you're not committing yourself to that having been successful. You're withholding that endorsement to the claim that you actually did what you were intentionally doing. I mean, one would have to elaborate this story, but I hope you can see that the door is open for us to make the same sort of move on the side of agency that Sellars' account of looks talk makes on the side of cognition, and see Descartes as making parallel moves here, having parallel theories, but making the same mistake in each case, and it's a descriptivist mistake. Okay, the other topic that I merely broached but didn't go into is at the end of the first half of the essay, Sellars revisits the issue of epistemological foundationalism and says, surprisingly, I mean, he knows it's surprising, that giving up the notion of givenness as epistemological regress stoppers, responses to the Ripon trilemma, doesn't mean you have to give up epistemological foundationalism. That there is a sense, he says, in which empirical knowledge has a foundation. It's not self-intimating episodes, because those were episodes which were cognitively significant, ultimate source of justification of claims about the empirical world, but were non-conceptual, or at least didn't presuppose the acquisition of concepts through coming into a language. But he says, non-inferential reports are, in a sense, a foundation of knowledge, in that, in his phrase, they're the ultimate court of justificatory appeal for empirical claims. So his picture is that when we disagree about how things are in the empirical world, ultimately it can come down to observations that will settle it. Well, look, let's go look. Galileo's Bellarmine, look through my telescope and you will see. We set up the apparatus and you say, well, if there are electrons running through that wire, the meter needle should swing to the right, and we look and we agree that that's what happened. Now, here it's important that Sellars doesn't think that non-inferential reports are a semantic foundation for empirical concepts generally. He doesn't think you can translate all empirical claims into claims about observables. And most importantly, he doesn't think that observation reports are a semantically autonomous stratum of the language. They're not a language game one could play though one played no other. Why not? Well, they have to be conceptually contentful in order to play any justificatory role at all. They have to stand in inferential relations. That is, you have to be able to use them to justify claims which are not themselves non-inferential observations, because you arrive at them by inferring them from observation reports. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't involve observables. You can infer that something's red from observing that it's crimson, or infer that it's colored from observing that it's red. The point is, and being crimson or being red or being colored, those are observable, but to call something a non-inferential report is to talk about the reporting, that particular tokening of the claim, that particular instance of your committing yourself to it. And the point is, in order to be conceptually contentful, every type of expression that has non-inferentially elicited or acquired tokenings must also have some inferential uses. So just the non-inferential uses, that's not a language game you could engage in, though you engaged in no other, because those things wouldn't stand in a space of implications. To stand in the space of implications, they have to have inferential uses as well as non-inferential uses. So Sellars says, if you give up the demand or the fantasy that the epistemological foundation of empirical knowledge is semantically autonomous, the idea that it makes sense that somebody should only be able to observe things, not to make any inferences, if you give that idea up, then it's okay to acknowledge the special role in justification of empirical claims that observation reports play. So he says, I'm an empiricist in that I think that the ultimate court of justificatory appeal for empirical claims is observation reports, reportings now. That's one sense in which he's still an empiricist in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. Epistemologically, he's an empiricist. I think that's way too much empiricism. And one way it is that he's committed to what I think is a fundamental mistake in epistemology. That is, what's true is that every particular chain of justifications comes to an end somewhere. At some point, your spade is turned and some claiming is playing the role of an unjustified justifier in that chain of justifications. But it doesn't follow from that, and I don't think it's true, that there is some class of claims such that every chain of justification ends up in one of those, in a claim of one of those kinds. Sellars thinks there is, and it's observation reports. But, sometimes we might settle our empirical dispute by realizing that one of the theories requires a violation of the conservation of energy and the other one doesn't. And say, well, you'd need a lot stronger argument than what we've done just in the laboratory here to claim that the conservation of energy was violated. Not that it's inviolable or that no evidence could convince us, but the little stuff we're doing here isn't enough to do that. That is when we see that the results I'm claiming, the claims I'm making could only be true if there were a violation of the conservation of energy, that's good enough. So, chains of justification can end in well-established theoretical claims and principles in citations of laws of nature, as well as in observation reports. Yes, observation reports play a distinguished role in justification of empirical claims. If we couldn't make observation reports, we couldn't make empirical claims. We couldn't understand them, but we couldn't be justified in them. So we should investigate the particular role that they do play, but that role is not being the ultimate regress stoppers of all justificatory chains. Philosopher Michael Williams has a book called Unnatural Doubts, in which he claims that the source of all skeptical hypotheses is assuming that there is some set of claims such that all chains of justification end in them. So skepticism about other minds says, well, all the justificatory chains have to end in some claim about the contents of my own mind. Skepticism about the external world says, well, all the justifications of claims about the external world have to end in, well, the Cartesian claims about my mind. That's just a quantifier inversion. What's true is for every chain of justification, universal quantification, there is some place that it ends. It's not the case that there is a class of claims such that for all chains of justification, they end there. That's getting the quantifiers wrong. So that's the first way in which I would say Sellars is still too traditionally foundationalist. Yeah.
Just a confirmatory question. I was wondering, in the law of conservation of energy example, is the statement that the law of conservation of energy is not or cannot be violated, is that statement regarded here as non-inferential, or is it stopping a justificatory chain but still being inferential?
I mean, I'm thinking this is all inferential, at this point.
Yeah.
And that, and it's not that, that the conservation of energy principle has a status that makes it immune from revision. It's just very well entrenched, very well confirmed, so that the weight of evidence you would need to justify giving it up or finding exceptions to it is exceptionally high. And so for most ordinary justification, if you could show that, that counts as refuting the claim. If you show that it would entail a violation of the conservation of energy. I would want to turn the crank one more time on the anti-foundationalism and say, if you really want to evade the Agrippin trilemma in epistemology, you have to give up one of its presuppositions. And the presupposition that is necessary and sufficient to evade it is that claims are unjustified until they're justified. That is, that the default status of claims is not to have a positive justificatory status, and that the only way they can get a positive justificatory status, the only way you can be entitled to these commitments is by an activity of justifying them, which is going to be an inferential activity of citing other things. I think we've seen that our actual practices are what in making it explicit I call, they exhibit what in making it explicit I call the default and challenge structure of entitlement. Whereas, some claims, if I say there have been black dogs, we all believe that. I'm entitled to say that until and unless you've got some reason to think that it's not so. That, if you have evidence that what I think of as dogs are really robots that the Martians sent down here to spy on us, well, okay, now we can assess whether your entitlement to that is better than my entitlement to the claim that there have been black dogs. At that point, the entitlements become questionable, and the activity of justifying is in order. If I glance out the window and say it's raining, I have a default entitlement to that. That's something it's easy for people to see. There's no particular reason to think I'm gaming you or lying about it. People who are normally wired up and trained have ranges of circumstances that they can report, and they have a default entitlement to them. We take them to be reliable about those things. So, I mean, there's general claims, sun was white, there have been black dogs. There's particular claims, it's raining out there, the lights turned red, and so on, that are innocent until proven guilty, rather than the other way around. So there's a picture of the way entitlement to commitments are acquired and transmitted that's in the background of the Agrippin trilemma. And it's a bad picture. It's not the way it actually works. Now someone could come back and say, oh, but if you're really serious about justification, it ought to work that way. Well, okay, we could have that discussion, but notice that there is this big questionable assumption behind that. Okay, that's all meant to be sort of cleaning up stuff that was left over from last time. The second half of Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind is devoted to the myth of Jones. Sellars says at the end, I've used a myth to kill a myth. Used the myth of Jones to kill the myth of the given. Myth of the given, I don't know, I only found out when they did a translation of our edition of EPM that in Italian it's il mito del dato. Il mito del dato. I like this version of it. That's sort of the way I think about it. Okay, we said the myth of the given is the idea that you can have, that there can be cognitively significant states that don't require concept acquisition, so that can play a role in justification, but don't require you to have acquired concepts. That's in general what the myth is. Now, Sellars is actually misdescribing what he's doing when he says the myth of Jones is to kill the myth of the given. The myth of Jones is doing something subtler than that. It's to kill a way of rejecting givenness that's overkill. Well, that didn't come out very well. It's to diagnose as going too far a certain way of rejecting the myth of the given. And that is to say, look, Descartes wasn't just wrong about the particular features of inner experience, cognitive on the side of appearance, active on the side of volition. He wasn't just wrong about the peculiar features of these inner experiences. The whole idea of inner experiences, of mental events, is wrong. Really talk about the mind is a mistaken way of talking about what we do, about behavior. Now, this was a Wittgensteinian theme, Wittgensteinian behaviorism that said there are no such things as pains. What there is pain behavior. And that's something that's public. There are no private events that is just your feeling of the pain. And there isn't anything that red looks like. There isn't any experience of red. There's no such thing as being appeared to redly that is sort of private to you, a state of your awareness. That, he says, is like the beetle in the box, where we each have one, we have a box, we have a beetle in it, but only we can look at our own beetle. You can't look at the other folks' beetles. Wittgenstein is skeptical about that. He says we're not really talking about anything representing mental events, either in our own talk about pains or sensings of red, or about each other's. That's a misdiagnosis of the way that talk works. Now, a whole battery of considerations that the late Wittgenstein raises for justifying this, but his claim, stay on the surface, everything is in public, look at what we do that isn't private to just one of us, but is out there in the public domain. Look at the discursive behavior. Don't look under the surface to what's supposedly in the inner theater. Gilbert Ryle had in 1949 published The Concept of Mind, and he said, talk about inner occurrences, the ghost in the machine, that's the title of the second chapter of The Concept of Mind, is an over-application of a mechanical worldview, where you say, well, mental occurrences are just like mechanical physical occurrences in the outside world, but they're in this spooky medium. But in there, there's still events, and they cause other events. And he said, this is not right at all. It's a category mistake, he says. What we're really talking about is our dispositions to behave. To say that somebody's angry isn't to describe some way it is in their inner theater. It's to talk about how they'll behave. They'll fly off the handle if you say something that shouldn't be that upsetting. Similarly, sort of on the other side, if you say that somebody's kind, you're not talking about some inner state that they have that gets expressed in their behavior. You're talking about how they're disposed to behave. This is what Sellars talks about as mongrel categorical hypothetical claims. Ryle's project in The Concept of Mind was to understand mistaken talk about states of affairs, mental states of affairs, as disguised, hidden, in the end, confused talk about subjunctive conditionals involving their behavior. To talk about what somebody believes, what they desire, what they intend, is to talk about what they would do if. Maybe in a very complicated, you're attributing a very complicated set of dispositions to them, committing yourself to the truth of a difficult to survey constellation of subjunctive conditionals, but that's what you're doing. That's why it's a category mistake. You're looking for states, and what there really are dispositions. So again, no beliefs, no desires, no intentions, no pains. That's dispositions too. Well, Wittgenstein, Ryle, they've swept away all those given states, all the ones that tempt one to an ideology of givenness. But Sellars says they've gone way too far. They think that in order to get rid of givenness, you have to get rid of innerness. You have to give up the idea that we have thoughts and sense impressions. And you don't. The myth of Jones is going to show us how you can do without, you can get rid of givenness without having to deny that we have a mental life. He does this to begin with by drawing a distinction within the mental between Rylian states and Jonesian episodes. He says, as far as his discussion here is concerned, he's going to accept Ryle's account of propositional attitudes, of beliefs, desires, intentions, hopes, these relatively long-term dispositional states that include the propositional attitudes. Those are all Rylian states. And for his purposes here, he's not going to contest Ryle's account of those. But, he says, mental episodes, paradigmatically thoughts and sense impressions, exactly the things that Descartes assimilates under the heading of pensées for bad epistemic reasons, but in striking contrast to the Aristotelian and scholastic tradition, which strictly separated the merely sensuous from the intelligible, so sense impressions from thoughts. But Sellars is going to say, no, there's room in our philosophy of mind, our scientifically minded philosophy of mind. There's room in it for inner episodes, specifically for thoughts and sense impressions. And I'm going to show you how you can do that. So I said his view is more subtle than using a myth of Jones to kill a myth. No, he wants to undercut an overreaction, a rejection of the given that throws the baby of mental activity out with the bathwater of givenness. You don't have to be a behaviorist. Now, maybe a week ago, I added another picture to the website between Wilfred of EPM and old Wilfred. And it's a picture taken at the tea party after the first of the three lectures that were Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind. And it's Wilfred in a rather splendid fur bedecked coat. He always was a dandy. In the 80s, he would sometimes wear spats. You know what this is? Shoe and sock covers that, people wore them at Oxford in the 30s when he was there, and by God, he wore them. Anyway, the other character there is Gilbert Ryle, who was his host for this. And one of the reasons I think that EPM worked so well as a set of lectures in London in 1956 was that they were all full of Wittgensteinian and Rylian behaviorism. And here was Sellars, who appreciated all of that, but was carefully showing them that you didn't need to give up something like common sense notions of us having occurrent thoughts. Oh, I just wondered, did I lock my car? Yeah. That's a different sort of thing from the belief that the Cathedral of Learning and the Washington Monument are exactly the same height, 555 feet. That's true, by the way. I have that belief. That's a Rylian sort of, anyway, it's plausible to understand that as a sort of long-term dispositional state that manifests mostly in my saying things, but could practically manifest in other ways. How fast would I say an object was falling when it hit the ground if you dropped it from the cathedral and from the Washington Monument, and so on. But it just occurring to me, did I leave the stove on? That occurrent thought, Wittgenstein and Ryle say, no, that's you're confused in thinking that is a kind of thing that can happen. I just had that sense impression of red. I don't know what it was. It may not have been caused by anything out there, but I had that sensation of red. It's not, that's a confusion. You're talking about a change in your dispositions when you do that. The idea that there's some event or episode that you're responding to, that you have to give up that idea. That was the Wittgenstein-Ryle line. And Sellars is saying, no, you don't. You absolutely don't need to do that. So, a via media, he's giving us a way to accept what was right and good about the insights that led to that behaviorism, but saying, no, you're overreacting and you don't need to bite this bullet. Let me explain how these can be respectable by your own lights. So the genius Jones comes in. He's born into a community of Rylians who use lethic modal vocabulary. They're comfortable with talking about dispositions, with asserting subjunctive conditionals and using them to describe each other's behavior. But Jones teaches them also to talk about thoughts and sense impressions in two different levels. Now, there is a bullet in the vicinity to be bitten, however. You can't understand those inner episodes the way Descartes understood them. So for Descartes, those inner episodes, pensées, of these two kinds, the sensuous and the discursive sensations and thoughts, what was alike about them is they were the paradigm of the observable. They were observable in a non plus ultra sense of observable. We've emphasized the incorrigibility part of that. They're observable, so you can't misobserve them. If you think you're having a particular mental episode, then you are. That's the incorrigibility. But they're even more observable than that. They're self-intimating episodes. That is, it's not just you can't be in error about them, you also can't be ignorant of them. It's not just that if you think something is going on in foro interno, that it is. It's that if it is, then you know that it is. Just by its occurrence, you know something. Okay, well, givenness is sloshing all over that conception of things. But the point is, the present point is that for Descartes, mental episodes were not just the paradigm of the observable, they were more observable than anything else. They were as observable as anything could be. They were essentially observable. They were awareness of themselves, self-intimating episodes. And Jones, growing up in a Rylian community, never heard of Descartes. He says, no, they're not even essentially observable. They're fundamentally theoretical objects. They're postulated to explain something. What they're postulated to explain is features of our discursive behavior. So, how could that be? The story's got two stages. Jones first teaches people to begin talking about their thoughts and then sense impressions. That's already two phases. As purely theoretical entities postulated to explain features of behavior. And then it turns out that after talking that way for a while, they come to be able to observe them. Now, how could that be? Sellars, in sort of characteristic time, he says, and then it turns out, need it have, that they can learn how to observe these things. And he leaves that as a rhetorical question. His answer, though he doesn't give it to us, is no, actually it's intelligible that they not have been able to do that. That's a way critters like us could have been. We aren't. So, to think about this, we have to think about the relation between observables and theoretical entities. Because his claim is going to be that behaviorism of Wittgenstein's and Ryle's sort is a special case of instrumentalism about theoretical entities. They object to postulating anything to explain features of our behavior. That's what Wittgenstein means when he says, stay on the surface. Everything that matters to philosophers is on the surface of our discursive behavior. You don't need to look for anything deep. You don't need to look below the surface to anything that isn't observable in what people are doing. The only sentence that's repeated verbatim from the Tractatus to the Investigations is, philosophy is not one of the natural sciences. And what Wittgenstein means by that is, it's no business of philosophers to postulate unobservables. That's characteristic of modern science. And Sellars absolutely agrees with Wittgenstein that that's what's distinctive about modern science. The method of explaining the applicability of some observable descriptions by postulating unobservables that stand in reliable relations to them. So the claim is going to be behaviorism of that logical sort. Ryle wants to define mental expressions in terms of behavioral dispositional expressions, and Wittgenstein just wants us to learn to do without them entirely. It's a kind of instrumentalism about theoretical entities that says what there really is what's observable, and talk about theoretical entities is just a convenience a kind of make-believe because it turns out that it's easier to systematize, get general rules to govern the observations plus a theory than it is just the observations. But the instrumentalist claims only the observational claims really have truth values. The theoretical claims are not making claims about how things are. They're just as ifs. They're calculational devices to get you from one set of observations to another. And Sellars says, that's bad philosophy of science. Instrumentalism is just wrong about theoretical entities, and bad in the philosophy of science is bad in the philosophy of mind. Once you've seen that behaviorism is a form of instrumentalism, and you've seen what's wrong with instrumentalism about theoretical entities, you won't be tempted to make the mistakes that Wittgenstein and Ryle did. So that's what I want to say next. So I said, look, a key move in the argument against givenness was that any set of observation reports of terms that have observational uses, no matter what it's an observation of, whether it's red things out there or pains in here, doesn't matter what you're reporting non-inferentially. Any concepts that have observational uses have to have non-observational inferential uses also. You have to be able to use them as premises in inferences, and you also have to be able to apply them as conclusions of inferences, red colored, so on. One of Sellars' methodological slogans is grasp of a concept is always mastery of the use of a word. So a word like red has observational uses, but if you tell me that the Macintosh apple is ripe, I can infer that it's red without looking at it. Even though red is a concept of an observable, that's just to say that some uses of it are elicited non-inferentially, but it always has to have other inferential uses. It has to be available to be a premise and a conclusion of an inference too. But there are some claims that don't have observational uses. They only have inferential uses. The only way you can become entitled to apply these concepts is by a process of inference from other things. So, when the notion of atom was introduced, in modern times, never mind Democritus, it was true of Democritus too, the only way you could be entitled to claims about the atomic natures of things was by inference from, for instance, weighing things, and so on. Though there are no purely observational concepts, that is, concepts every use of which is a non-inferential response to some environing circumstance, there are purely inferentially accessible. There are concepts that only have inferential uses when they're introduced, concepts like atom, like gene, like electron, are like this. But Sellars says, this is the most important thing to realize, that the distinction between observable and theoretical is an epistemological distinction, a methodological distinction. It's a distinction between two ways of knowing about something. It's not a distinction between two kinds of thing. It's not an ontological distinction. Don't make the Platonic error, which Descartes repeated, and that is to draw ontological conclusions from epistemological distinctions. Plato saw that we had two very different ways of knowing about things, through our senses and through our intellect, and said, well, let's think about these two different kinds of things then, the sensible things and the intelligible forms. I mean, good thing he did, all a series of footnotes to Plato, but sometimes the same thing can be known through the senses and through the intellect. Descartes said, look, there are these things we can't be mistaken about or fail to do. Those are mental things. And there's the stuff we can make mistakes about and can have practical failures about. That's the rest of the world. Use that epistemological distinction to make an ontological distinction. Well, regardless of whether that's ever okay, it's not okay if the two ways are non-inferential observation on the one hand and theoretical concepts that only have inferential uses. And the way to see that is that things can cross the boundary from one to the other. When the member of our solar system, formerly known as a planet, Pluto, was first introduced and even named, it was a purely theoretical object. It was postulated to explain perturbations in the orbit of Neptune. It was a triumph of calculation that you could show that if there were a body of this mass and with an orbit like this, that Neptune would wobble in its orbit in just the way it did. But that happened 50 years before Clyde Tombaugh could see it through a telescope. Had a telescope good enough that you could point it at the place where theory said this postulated, until now, only inferentially accessible object was, and lo and behold, there it was. And in that moment, Pluto ceased to be a purely theoretical entity, only accessible inferentially, and became observable as well. Claims about Pluto, badly designed that I'm talking about both Plato and Pluto. It's a history of philosophy from Plato to NATO. Yeah. Okay. Look, Pluto didn't change. The Plutonians didn't notice anything when this happened, right? I mean, Pluto was just what it was. It didn't change then any more than it changed when it ceased to be a planet, right? That had to do with its relation to us, not what it was like. And that's what observability is like. And when we get electron microscopes and can observe features of cells that we had only conjectured before, had theorized about, had made good inferentially based, drawn good inferentially based conclusions about, well, we came to be able to observe them. They didn't change ontologically. It was just a methodological change, an epistemological change, a change in their relation to us. That's what instrumentalists get wrong. They think theoretical objects are a kind of thing, as opposed to calling something a theoretical object, describing a feature of our epistemic relation to it. That right now, the only way we can be entitled to make claims about this sort of thing is by inference. But there are no things that, in principle, you can't observe. It just depends on what instruments we've got. Inference is one way of finding out about things, and we can find out about them non-inferentially as well. Yeah, Harry.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is helpful. So I just sort of going to Plato, not Pluto, but I'm just wondering whether one might think that there's another kind of reason to think that there should be a distinction between kinds of things here, and sort of drawing on Plato and ancient philosophy, one might think that knowledge and these sort of epistemic things are about universals, whereas observations are about particulars, and then that would be one way of sort of trying to say that, sort of give a reason for making a distinction between types of things.
Well, good. I mean, there's a big can of worms that you open up. For one thing, you're presupposing that particulars and universals are different kinds of things. Maybe they is, maybe they ain't. We're going to talk about universals next time. But put that to one side. What makes you think I can't see universals? I see colors. Can I even see that red as a color? Maybe. I can see that something's red without there being any particular shade of red that I see that it is. Okay, that's not particulars and universals, that's determinables that are more determinate or less determinate, but in that scale, not clear. So yes, you certainly shouldn't simply take Sellars' word for it, or even mine, that it's always a mistake to look for an ontological distinction behind an epistemological distinction. That would be going way too far. He thinks this was the Platonic mistake, this was the Cartesian mistake, but as you say, a whole story would need to be told about each of those things, which in different places he more or less does. But he's not wrong about theoretical and observable. This was the mistake the instrumentalists made. And look, by and large, there aren't any instrumentalists in the philosophy of natural science anymore. People just, but whether they exactly realized this lesson, they always had sort of there was a bad epistemology as well as a bad ontology behind that move. But it's by no means the case that there aren't any instrumentalists in other areas. Well, Sellars is saying there are in the philosophy of mind, where the behaviorists don't realize that this is a disreputable move. But there are in semantics. Where the items in question are meanings. And again, Wittgenstein leads the way. Don't look to the meaning, look to the use. He thinks of meanings as theoretical entities that are postulated to explain regularities in our discursive behavior, to systematize our linguistic practice, to get a general theory of it, by postulating these things, meanings that are associated with expressions, explain why I said what I said, starting with a grasp of the meaning, and then maybe a belief, and so on. But Wittgenstein thinks our practice is a motley. It can't be systematized. Any postulation of meanings to explain discursive behavior is going to be partial and fragile. He's a semantic nihilist. And his principle that philosophy differs from science in that it doesn't postulate unobservables extends to meanings. That's not the philosopher's business. Just describe the behavior. Don't try to explain it by postulating unobservables. Nonsense, Sellars says. Scientific philosophy postulates unobservables. Michael Dummett imposes a manifestability condition on semantics. You can't attribute any meaning to an expression that can't be manifested in the behavior of those who grasp the meaning, that is, who understand the expression. And on the basis of that, he argues that the correct logic has to be intuitionism, not classical logic, because there's no way to manifest in our behavior the meaning of the claim. There are 400,000 consecutive sevens in the decimal expansion of pi. The classical logician thinks that's either true or it's false. But Dummett says, you can't manifest your grip of the meaning of that claim in any way at all. And that means you can't mean it. Dummett's a behaviorist in semantics because he's an instrumentalist. He doesn't permit the postulation of theoretical entities like meanings unless you can translate the claim about meaning into a claim about behavior. Meaning is to behavior as theory is to observation. He forbids us to have a theory that can't be translated into observational terms. That's instrumentalism. There's no good methodological reason to impose that. So Jones introduces thoughts into his Rylian community to explain why we continue to make sense even when there's silence in the conversation for a period of time. So the idea is, if we just chattered all the time, rehearsed the consecutive sequence of claims that we want to make, then we would see why at the end of that chain I'm saying something that is relevant to what I was saying at the beginning of it. Why my contribution to the conversation, even though I was quiet for a while, actually is on topic and advancing the discussion. He says, if you'd been chattering away, even silently, whispering, going through the intermediate steps, then we'd know how you'd done it. And sometimes the Rylians do that. But sometimes they just make sense, make a contribution to the conversation, even though they haven't done that. And he said, well, I'm going to postulate that when you're not talking, you're thinking, I shall call it, that you're speaking, but in a way that nobody can hear. That all of that chain of reasoning that you can go through out loud, you're going through silently. Now you might say, look, isn't that obvious? I mean, don't you need to think before you speak in order to make sense? Well, do you need to think before you think in order to make sense? At some point, you're going to have to accept that we have a capacity for consecutive thought. Paradigmatically, a chain of inferences that are really good inferences. But there's all kinds of other things we do, raising considerations, weighing evidence, and so on, all of which we can do out loud. Don't you need to think before you do it out loud? Well, there's a potential regress there, and wherever it stops, it's not clear that thinking is a better place than talking. Indeed, typically, when you're talking, you haven't thought out in advance what you're going to say. You just make sense. Now, it's a good question how we do that, but by and large, the philosopher's job is to say what doing the trick consists in, not how we do it. And it's the psychologists have to figure out how we do it. But it's not a harder question for talking than it is for thinking. Indeed, thinking before you talk is the exception rather than the rule. It wouldn't make much difference to our lives if we couldn't actually think subvocally. If anything we thought we had to say, it would make things a lot easier for the secret police to find out if you're plotting to overthrow the government by force and violence. They just have to listen to you to see. It might make our personal lives more difficult, but there isn't any fundamental difference between a species that could only think out loud and one that could also sometimes suppress the utterance of it. I mentioned last time about how surprisingly late and surprisingly difficult learning to read silently was. Learning to think consecutively silently could be like that. It is for the Jonesians. When he introduces the notion of thoughts as inner speakings, he says, any theoretical model like this, there's the model in the commentary, to think of it as inner speakings doesn't mean, he says, that you have to think of it as the wagging of an inner tongue, but some language of thought in which you make utterances. But because these are theoretical entities, they're only inferentially accessible, and that means I may have as good evidence for what you're thinking as you do. We've sort of got the same evidence. The things you say, the things you do. And we say, well, he must have thought, he must have realized at a certain point that the battery was dead, even though he didn't actually say anything. And you yourself, having gotten the car working again, say, yeah, at some point I must have thought that it's because of the battery, so if I replace the battery or recharge it, it'll be good. Now, it turns out that after people have been getting really good at thought talk, some of them come to be able to report what they thought, not by making the same inference about it from their behavior that you would do, but just off the bat, just non-inferentially. we can confirm that they're right because we can do it inferentially and say, oh yeah, he must have done this. But sometimes you say, it just occurred to me a minute ago that it must be the battery. When you haven't inferred that from your behavior, it just turned out that you could respond non-inferentially to the occurrence of that thought. And it crosses over the boundary from being a purely theoretical class of entities to being an observable one. Now, look how once again Sellars has turned Descartes on his head, right? Thoughts were supposed to be the paradigm of the observable thing, more observable than anything else, right? And Sellars is saying, actually, it's not an essential feature of thought that it be observable. It's an accidental feature of it. Convenient, to be sure, but not an essential feature of it. The underlying logic and grammar of inner episode talk, he says, is the logic and grammar of theoretical entities. This logic and grammar talk is mid-50s philosophical talk. But if you want to understand how thought talk works, think of this just so story of Jones. Jones among the Rylians, introducing thoughts as theoretical objects, that is, as purely inferentially accessible, which it then turns out we can non-inferentially report. And maybe some of us are better at it than others. Maybe some people never catch on to it. Maybe there's some kinds of thoughts that people are better at rehearsing than others. Once you think about this, think about how many times you've surprised yourself by saying something that, ideally expressed an understanding of something that was, as it came out of your mouth, sort of as new to you as it was to anybody else. May that happen to you often, but that kind of thing can happen to you, and you sort of wonder, well, where did that come from? What was I thinking? Sometimes that happens, maybe it happens more often, it's more obvious for the bad ideas than for the good ideas. Well, your own thoughts are probably differentially observable to you. Under some circumstances, you have a pretty good idea what you're thinking right now, and on others, you may only be able to infer it later, if that. Somebody else might have a better idea about what you were thinking. If you read philosophical texts or grade undergraduate papers, you can sometimes see what they were thinking better than they could see it. Inferentially, you can see it. You made this move because you think you can move the modal operator outside the conditional. That's the mistake you made. That's how you were thinking. Yeah.
It is still not very clear to me what exactly happens to our Rylian ancestors when they start to use the concept doting and reporting. Because so far they learned the concept of dote by practice third-person attribution based on behavioral evidence. And how they can suddenly realize that very same concept can be applied in a very different way, third-person immediate attribution?
Okay. I hear you. It seems like a big change. It's not just third personal, because you can reason this way about yourself as well as anyone else. what happens is you find yourself with an urge to avow a thought, which you have not inferentially, you haven't gone through the chain of reasoning that would be involved in attributing it to yourself. You just find yourself with this urge to express it. And then when you go through the chain of inferences, you say, oh yeah, that must have been what I was thinking. And so these urges, you resist less. You come to trust them more. They're like the urge to think out loud, that is to say anything. It's just sometimes what you're doing is not just making the claim that the frog is on the log. You're making this different claim. I just thought there's something on that log. Oh, it's a frog. That's what was going on that led to my saying the frog is on the log. And now we think and we say, yeah, that makes sense, because probably you didn't get that good a look. And first you just saw something green, and then you said this. So, Sellars has started with this distinction between Rylian and Jonesian. The Rylian sort of psychological, propositional attitude states that you can think of as, Ryle thinks of them as purely dispositional. Sellars calls them mongrel, categorical, hypothetical. We're attributing a belief, but we're committing ourselves to a lot of things about what you would do or say if, in doing that. Putting the Rylian ones to one side and showing how you could add to that these Jonesian episodes that are genuinely mental, not just psychological thoughts here. Now, I'm going to give very short shrift to the sense impressions. But once the thought game is going on, and Jones has already gotten tenure for inventing thoughts, for his career-capping move, gets asked to give the Locke lectures, and what he does there is invent sense impressions. And sense impressions are like thoughts in that they're purely theoretical entities, only inferentially accessible. They're postulated to explain features of our behavior, but quite different features than thoughts were postulated to explain. This is to explain why people sometimes, when they're looking at a coin sitting on the table that they know perfectly well is round, will mistakenly report its shape as elliptical. And sometimes, when they're looking at something that in North Sky daylight they can tell is blue, sometimes they'll call it green. And he's saying, well, in the reliably covarying chain of causal events that starts with the green circular thing, let's say, and goes through a cascade, stuff happens behind your retinas, and in there somewhere is a replica that isn't colored and it doesn't have a shape, but these replicas systematically stand to one another in relations that are roughly isomorphic to the relations that colors stand into one another and shapes stand into one another. And my theory about how we see colors and shapes is that usually green things cause replicas in us that have this property, I'll call it green star, that is systematically related to the other starred color properties. And I've learned to respond by saying there's something green when I have a green star replica. And similarly for an elliptical star replica. And the thing is that the mechanism that produces these replicas is not infallible. Usually green things, the visible presence of green things, causes green star replicas, but not always. And when it doesn't, you mistakenly think there's something green. And usually the circular objects cause circular star replicas, and that's how you learn to call things circular, but not always. And these sense impressions are what explain why you make mistakes in the way that you do. That's because of the mismatch between the stars and the starred properties and the real properties. And he's confident that neurophysiologists will tell us in the fullness of time what green star is and circular star is and so on. Those are going to be some neurophysiological properties. But that will be another turn of the Jonesian crank. Right now, they're just theoretical entities that we can infer the presence of from our mistakes. Again, it turns out, needed have? Well, it really needn't have. It might not have turned out that people could report the replicas in the absence of anything to cause them. Apparently we have these replicas at night when we're asleep sometimes. LSD can cause green star replicas without the presence of green things. So, as I said, there's a lot of details there, but the overall move is to say, if you're not an instrumentalist, you don't need to stay at the level of behavior when you're doing philosophy of mind. You don't need to be able to translate your claims about psychological and mental things into claims about behavior for it to be respectable. Postulate on observables that are kinds of mental episodes. And if they're good theories, insofar as they're good theories, those things really exist. And, we'll find out what they are when the neurophysiologists get that far, for the thoughts as well as the sense impressions. But to be a realist about theoretical entities is to think that insofar as your theory is good, that's reason to think that the entities it postulates are real. And we shouldn't be instrumentalists in the philosophy of science, we shouldn't be instrumentalists in the philosophy of mind, and we shouldn't be instrumentalists in semantics. The question is, do you have a good theory? Have you postulated things that really can explain what's going on? Are the inferences that you're making good inferences? So, of course, Ryle liked it that Sellars brought the Rylians into his story, but he could also see how this was a sophisticated step beyond the way they were thinking about things. That the idea that what we care about ultimately is the discursive behavior, that was right. And that anything else has to show its credentials in terms of that behavior. But what he hadn't seen was the analogy that behavior is to the mind as observations are to a theory. So that just as you wouldn't expect to translate all your theoretical terms into observational equivalence, just insofar as you're a realist about theoretical entities. In the philosophy of science, so you should be in the philosophy of mind. It had never occurred to anybody to think about what Sellars calls scientific behaviorism, that says, the claims about behavior, that's what we're trying to explain in the way that, our theories are trying to explain our observations. But nobody had thought about the mind standing to behavior as theory is to observation because of this lingering Cartesian idea of the essential observability of mental things. But if you just think of thoughts as theoretical posits, postulates, and if you just think of meanings as postulated to explain verbal behavior, linguistic behavior, then there's room to acknowledge all these things. Okay, I wanted to get that far before the break, so I've run us a little bit late. Let's come back at 1:15. Okay. Before I talk about phenomenalism, I'd like to talk a little bit about observation and theory in the way, theoretical terms and observational terms, in the way Sellars has set up here, even though what I'm going to talk about isn't anything he talks about in the essay that we're reading. So it's important to him that any concepts have to stand in a space of implications, have to be inferentially articulated. That, remember, in introducing the myth of the given, I said there's two senses in which something could be non-inferential. We could be talking about its causal antecedents. Was this claim made as the culmination of a process of inference or not? Was it the result of a language move in some reflections on language games or not? And that notion's okay. That's the notion of non-inferentiality on which observation reportings, believings acquired through observing, believings that are observings, are non-inferentially elicited. The other sense of non-inferential is not standing in inferential relations to other things. And no concepts are like that. In particular, observable concepts of observables are not. Concepts that have observational uses also have to have non-observational inferential uses. Theoretical entities, theoretical concepts are ones that at the time they're introduced, or anyway the time they're theoretical, only have inferential uses. Their circumstances and consequences of application are inferential. Now there's a picture here of what you need for something to be observable. And I think relatively radical conclusions can be drawn from this picture. And that's what I want to do now. On this picture, what I call in the chapter of the Sellars book that was in the supplementary readings, the two-ply conception of observation. For any concept, you need to have mastered the concept. So you need to have the practical know-how to tell what follows from it, what would be evidence for it, what's incompatible with it, and so on. For some of them, you have another way of becoming entitled to those claims. And that's by exercising a reliable differential responsive disposition. I'm going to say that a lot, so I'm going to call it an RDRD, reliable differential responsive disposition. That's what, if you're not colorblind, you can have to read things. You're reliably disposed to respond differentially to read things by saying that's red, or if you're a pigeon, we can teach you to have that same RDRD, but you just peck at the one button that we've conditioned you with. So any concept has to have the inferential articulation. Some concepts also you can become entitled to apply them non-inferentially by exercising an RDRD. But that's all you need for observational uses and for a concept of observables. And that means that a lot more is observable than you might think. So when I'm a novice particle physicist, and I'm first introduced to bubble chambers, I see this hooked vapor trail in the chamber. And I've done my homework, and I know that I can infer from that the presence of a mu meson. Mu mesons are still purely theoretical entities for me. The only way I can find out that it's there is by inferring it from the presence of what's directly observable to me, the hooked vapor trail. But now the experienced physicist has got this reliably covarying chain of events that starts with the mu meson, which reliably causes the hooked vapor trail, and so on, until she applies the concept mu meson. Now, what makes it a mu meson that she's making a claim about, rather than a hooked vapor trail, is what concept she applies. Well, she may get to the point that she doesn't have to notice the vapor trail and make an inference from it. You put her in that situation, she just reports the presence of a mu meson. The fact that the hooked vapor trail is somewhere in this chain of reliably covarying events that culminates in her making a report doesn't mean that that's what she sees, what she reports. That's a matter of what concept she applies. She can apply that same concept inferentially if one of the steps in that reliably covarying chain of events is an inference. But she may get to the point where it isn't. She still needs the bubble chamber in order to see these things, but that's why you can genuinely see things on television, say. You're not making an inference from the pixels on the screen. They're just part of the reliably covarying chain of events. Or think about the archaeologist who, to begin with, can only tell Aztec from Toltec pot shards by taking them into the laboratory and doing a chemical test. But after spending a lot of time with this, finds she can actually sort them. And when she takes them into the lab, she finds, I put all the Aztec ones in this pile and all the Toltec ones in this pile. She now has acquired a reliable differential responsive disposition to sort these things. Well, she can see the Aztecness or Toltecness of them. Even if she couldn't tell you what it's like, she says, these resemble each other, these resemble each other. I can't tell you in what way, but I can reliably sort them. In a sequence of papers that John McDowell and I exchanged, we talk about blind sight and super blind sight cases, and the case of the chicken sexers, who their job was to take these newly hatched chicks and tell whether they were male or female. the males are no good. You only need one male out of 100. Females are the ones that lay eggs. So throw the males away, keep the females. And it was discovered after a while what even the chicken sexers didn't know. Not everyone can catch on to this, but some people could catch on and do it very quickly. They all assumed that they were doing it by looks. They all turned the chick up, looked at its bottom. But it turned out they weren't at all. They were doing it by smell. And you could tell this because if they had a cold and their nose was stuffed up, they couldn't do it. And it turned out, once this hypothesis had been raised, that they could do it in the dark. Didn't even know which sensory mode they were doing it in. But they had the RDRDs, and they had the concept of the male and the females. So in this view, it's not the case that how proximal or distal to you in the causal chain of reliably covarying events something is determines whether it's visible to you or observable to you. The question is, are any of the links in that chain inferential, and what concept are you applying? Now, people have thought, all you literally see is irradiations of your sensory surfaces, your retina, just the most proximal things. That's what Quine thought, for instance. Because every step in this reliably covarying chain of events is a step where something can go wrong. You're going to be more reliable the more proximal to your claiming the thing is. And this gave aid and comfort to the idea that the world is painted in secondary qualities. I'm just going to stick with the visual here. Distinction between secondary and primary qualities goes back to Galileo. The primary qualities are the ones that are in the thing itself. The secondary qualities involve its relation to us. And the thought was really all you can see is these secondary qualities. The world is painted in them, and everything else you have to know about inferentially. But that's not right. You can literally see other things by applying a concept that picks out something more distally. And let me say parenthetically, it's wrong about what secondary qualities are, too. If you think about secondary quality concepts in relation to what I've just said about observable concepts, and this is an idea I got from Gareth Evans, but Gareth Evans doesn't endorse this idea. He just sort of put all the pieces on the table here. Secondary quality concepts are essentially observable concepts. So in a sense in which red is and square isn't. So both of them are observational concepts. You can tell whether something's square or a circle, let's say, by looking at it. You can tell whether something's red by looking at it if you've got all the equipment. The blind geometer can't tell a square by looking at it, but that doesn't mean she doesn't fully grasp the concept of a square. Will you shut that now? It doesn't mean she can't fully grasp the concept of a square. On the other hand, there is a sense in which if you can't tell red things by looking at them, you don't really have the concept red. There's something you're missing, something essential to redness that you're missing if it's not an observational concept for you. That's what makes it a secondary quality concept, is that unless it's an observational concept for you, you're not fully master of it. You don't fully grasp the concept. Square isn't like that, though it is an observable concept for most of us, but you can fully grasp it without being able to tell them by looking at it. Now, on this functional account of secondary quality concepts, you can make a secondary quality concept corresponding to any observational concept. I can introduce a concept, call it visibly square, such that you only have the concept visibly square if you not only have the geometrical inferential grasp of it that the blind geometer has, but also can tell a square, a visible square, when you look at one. That's a secondary quality concept formed from a merely observational concept. Now, if you think about them that way, you'll see there's no necessity that empirical knowers have any secondary quality concepts. You could observe things perfectly well without applying any concepts, such that you couldn't have that concept unless it was an observable concept for you. But you can also see why there'd be some point in having secondary quality concepts. And you can see how you could introduce one corresponding to any merely observable concept. Well, mu meson can become an observational concept. They can become observable in the instrument by the properly trained people who've got this thing. There's still not going to be secondary quality concepts. You're not going to say, well, you don't know what a mu meson is if you can't tell one when you see it in the bubble chamber. But the idea that all you really know is secondary qualities, no, if you think about it in these functional terms, you're just not going to be tempted by that line of thought. Okay, that's a detour on secondary quality concepts. But what are the limits of observability once we allow, on the one hand, that people can genuinely observe things with instruments, even though there's no way to say in secondary quality term, well, what does a mu meson look like? Well, there aren't any sort of secondary quality specifications of it's looking like a mu meson in the way that there are for the hooked vapor trail. But that doesn't mean that I can't really see mu mesons and not just hooked vapor trails. But if observation just requires RDRDs and the concept to pick out where in the chain of reliably covariant events the thing you're reporting is, if you have that conception of observation, which at least is a clear conception. It's the one that McDowell and I were contesting in this series of articles. His view is that isn't observation. He always called it bobservation, just so as to keep the separate, keep the book separate on it. I won't use that term, but that's what I mean when I'm talking about it. People say, look, one of my problems about being a moral realist is these norms, and I'll say I don't much care about moral normativity because I'm a natural kind skeptic about the kind moral, but I care a lot about norms, discursive norms. Look, one of the troubles with sort of fitting them in an object naturalist way into my universe is you can't see a norm. They're not observable. Really? They are observable if you can get hooked up to one by an RDRD and have the concept. Oh, I think that meanings are conceptual roles, inferential roles, and those are normative phenomena. I think you can hear meanings. I think when you listen to me, you don't primarily hear the noises that I make. You hear what I'm saying. And indeed, would have to perform a sort of phenomenological epoche, stepping back to pay attention to the noises. This is why if you're suitably bilingual, it can happen that you can't remember afterwards what language this conversation was in. Which one were we speaking? This is a point that John and I agree about, as opposed to Donald Davidson, who claims you only hear noises and you make inferences according to a theory that gets you to the meanings. No, you hear the meanings, and those are normative. You can hear what it's appropriate to conclude from what I say. That can be part of what you hear or see when you read something. I think that even thick moral normative concepts like cruelty have literal observational uses, where when Nietzsche broke down seeing the frustrated tanner beating his horse to death because it couldn't get up and pull the cart anymore, he could see the cruelty. And indeed, I think cruelty may be a secondary quality concept, in the sense that if you can't see the cruelty in him beating that helpless animal to death, you don't fully grasp the concept cruelty. McDowell, on behalf of Aristotelians, will say, well, you weren't properly brought up right. Yes, that's true. And because you weren't properly brought up right, you can't see paradigmatic, visible acts of cruelty. You can't see cruelty. And if you can't, then there's a sense in which you don't grasp that concept. One of the differences between those thick concepts and thinner concepts like justice as fairness is that you don't need to be able to see that something is procedurally fair or unfair in order to have the concept. You may have to calculate, do your utilitarian calculation or your Rawlsian calculation in order to conclude inferentially that that's unjust. That's okay. But thick concepts like cruelty, kindness, are not like that. Arguably, they are secondary quality concepts. And meaning may be, as a normative concept, may be like that, in that unless you can sometimes see or hear the meaning, you really don't grasp it. It's got to be observable for you. So, look, all of this is hugely controversial. I may put another one of those essays where McDowell and I are hassling about this in the, I'll put it in the suggested reading for this week, but it's only if you care about it. But the point is, on this conception, the boundaries around what's observable, about what you can literally see, are not maybe where you thought they were. And this is something that matters for thinking about lots of things, thinking in value theory. Can you be an empiricist value theorist, for instance? This matters. Okay, I've left very little time to talk about the pretty argument in the Phenomenalism essay, but let me do that now. So Phenomenalism was the constructive philosophical program in the first half of the 20th century of defining or explaining objective talk about physical objects in experiential phenomenological terms. So in its purest form, translating objective talk into a phenomenalist vocabulary, translating an objective vocabulary into a phenomenalist vocabulary. And I think the three index events, the three index figures are C.I. Lewis, beginning in Mind in the World Order in 29, and then continued in sort of his first book and his last book, An Analysis of Knowledge and Valuation, in the mid-40s. Both of them are pushing a phenomenalist account where in the mature account, what things the language he's translating into consists of what he calls terminating judgments. And terminating judgments are about what I would experience if. So if I turn my head, I would see the light, say. Or really in the phenomenal, it would seem to me like this in some phenomenal vocabulary. And he then wants to associate with each non-terminating judgment, like there's a water bottle in front of me, an infinite set of terminating judgments, saying what would happen if I were to pick it up, if I were to move my head, and so on. What experiences would I have specified in a phenomenal vocabulary? The same year that Mind in the World Order came out from C.I. Lewis, 1929, Carnap does his Habilitationsschrift in Leipzig, der logische Aufbau der Welt, the Aufbau, it's usually called. Aufbau is construction, the logical construction of the world, using purely extensional Principia Mathematica language, trying to translate there's a red apple in front of me into a purely phenomenal vocabulary, using the tools of modern logic as the new glue to hold together the same bricks that traditional British empiricism had started with, these sort of image-like experiences. And in 1950, Nelson Goodman's The Structure of Appearance, that uses as the basic thing what he called Erlebs, after the German Erlebnisse, which was what Carnap had used, but where C.I. Lewis had used subjunctive conditionals, a lethic modal vocabulary. Carnap restricted himself to extensional logical vocabulary, but with a healthy helping of set theory, and Goodman did it with mereology, mereological tools to stick the Erlebs together. But for all of them, the idea was to give at least functional equivalence, translations of objective vocabulary into experiential vocabulary. And in the Phenomenalism paper, Sellars makes two good arguments, two main points. One is that phenomenal vocabulary is not semantically autonomous. It's not a language game you could play, though you played no other. Oh, now that's something we're familiar with because that's the vocabulary of appearances. The structure of appearance is Goodman's. That's statements about how things merely look. And if we understand Sellars' lesson about the use of such expressions, we'll see that's not autonomous. Okay, that's drawing a conclusion from the argument that we've already seen, that why would you want to do this phenomenalist translation if you didn't think that the phenomenal vocabulary was semantically autonomous, that you could just speak that? If that's not true, don't you lose the point of translating the one into the other? But the other point is just a very pretty point, and none of these three great phenomenalists had realized it, and that is that one way or another, everybody's using these subjunctive conditionals. It's just the later ones had sort of philosophical grounds to pretend that they weren't, and so had to try and reconstruct those in logical terms of quantifiers in Carnap's case, and mereological inclusions and fusions in Goodman's case. So look at the C.I. Lewis case, and let me just remind you that C.I. Lewis and Carnap were both Sellars heroes, and in the case of C.I. Lewis, teacher, and Quine's. So the fact that C.I. Lewis and Carnap sort of started off with this phenomenalism, that was enough to make this important. But what Sellars points out is, if not only the consequence of these terminating judgments, these subjunctive conditionals, if not only the consequence of them are in phenomenalist terms, but so are the antecedents, then they aren't true. It just isn't the case that if I seem to turn my head to the left, I will seem to see that scene. What's true is if I really do turn my head to the left, I will seem to see that scene. It's not true that if I seemed to turn around the apple, I would seem to see what's in fact its other side. Who knows what I would seem to see? Drugs, dreaming, whatever. That the phenomenalist reduction only makes sense if the antecedents of those conditionals are in objective form. If you put everything into phenomenalist form, the things you translate it into aren't true, and so couldn't be the translation of true objective claims. Now that's an easy argument. I think it's a very pretty argument. It's a way of emphasizing the fact that the phenomenalist vocabulary isn't semantically autonomous, that the only reason it matters to us, sort of how things look, is because of the way the looks interdigitate with us talk about actually doing things, turning our heads, walking around. If I went into the kitchen in the middle of the night and turned on the light, would the apple still be there on the, yes, to say it's objective is to say if I were to go down in the middle of the night, even though nobody's been watching it, as soon as I turned on the light, I would see it again. I would have the same airlabes that I had before. Yeah, but not if I just seemed to do that. Who knows what would happen in those cases. So Sellars does not, in fact, appeal to his analysis of Looke's talk in order to argue the semantic non-autonomy of phenomenalist talk. But he does point out that the strategy they were using to do this translation was really not thought through, even though C.I. Lewis wrote his first book, and it was almost 20 years before he wrote the second book. He didn't figure this out in the meantime. Now, hardly anybody is a phenomenalist anymore. I say hardly anybody because people who have wanted to use two-dimensional modal logic in semantics and the philosophy of mind have immediately run to phenomenalism in order to do it. So Frank Jackson in his Locke lectures, David Chalmers, I'm not sure whether the current time slice of Chalmers is doing this, but passed through a phase when he was doing this. To get the second dimension, sorry, I'm maybe assuming this is too familiar. So in ordinary one-dimensional modal logic, the counsel of wisdom was that great modal logician Abraham Lincoln, who said, if we all agree to count the tail as a leg, how many legs would horses have? And the answer is 4, because you can't change how many legs horses have by changing how you talk. That's true on one dimension of the modal logic. On the other dimension is the one where the correct answer is 5. Under those circumstances, horses would have 5. Where we're holding fixed the way we talk instead of the way the world is. But the question is, what do you mean holding fixed the way we talk? And their answer is, well, I mean the experiences that we would have that are the same by hypothesis from possible world to possible world without our needing concepts to keep track of them. That depends on being able to translate everything into a phenomenalist vocabulary, as well as assuming that experiences are modally rigid, but non-conceptually, preconceptually. Okay, that's just a gesture in a direction, but I'm saying there are contemporary phenomenalists, and it probably will not have escaped your notice that it's an extremely delicate matter to go very deep into contemporary consciousness studies without either committing the myth of the given or running afoul of one of these other arguments about secondary qualities and phenomenalism that I've been retailing. I don't say it can't be done. I say it's an iotance, a dance on eggs, to do that. Maybe I should confess that some years ago, David Chalmers invited me to an NEH summer seminar he was doing to talk Sellars to consciousness people. Galen Strawson was the week after me to come back and give the true faith. And one of the outcomes of these NEH summer seminars, that sort of philosophy camp that people would go to, was a T-shirt that goes with it. And the one Chalmers asked people to contribute was front and back is just proofs that P that you have heard over the summer from some of the philosophers who spoke. And I don't remember many of them, but the one that was assigned to Brandom was Wilfrid Sellars has proven to my satisfaction and to John McDowell's that P, therefore P. So at any rate, that was the way sounded to them. Maybe you'd be able to actually prove the P on that basis. Okay, next week, now for something completely different. I will warn you, if you haven't already been looked ahead and been daunted, it's a huge amount of reading for next week. The two essays are each 50 pages long. And now would be a good time for me to say, but at least it's not difficult, but it's ferociously difficult. I said at the beginning that this treatment of universals and abstract objects was the part of Sellars' philosophy that was best realized. It's the part he really figured out and worked out, nailed down, made as bulletproof as it can be made. In that sense, it's the best work he ever did. Sort of close to the ground as just a matter of nailing it down, working it out. It is then savagely ironic that almost no Sellarsians care about it at all or write about it at all. And almost all of them, right-wing, left-wing, can't even see why it's in his synoptic vision. Why did he care about this? But it is our beginning to think about the nominalism, the world of facts, world of particulars, and so on. We're really, everything we've done up till now has been propedeutic to that, getting us in a position, and I hope giving Sellars some cred with you, that you believe, yeah, he has some important ideas as a guy worth going down the road with. But the themes that I really want to talk about are not the ones we've done so far, except the anti-descriptivism one. So we're moving from the left side of the diagram to the top of the diagram now. 2 weeks just on abstract objects, and then a week on alethic modality. Those are all top side of it. Anyway, get a running start on these essays. All will be made clear, I promise. In particular, we get the technical devices. Dot quotes, well, you won't get that till 2 weeks from now. I mean, I will next week, but he doesn't until naming and saying. Jumblies is logic without predicates, is nominalistic logic, and distributive singular terms, the things he's going to use to analyze abstract objects. So I just want to warn you, it's going to be a little bit overwhelming, sort of slog through it, and I promise I will boil it down so you can get it. But there's a lot of logic chopping and there's a lot of construction going on here. But it's good stuff.